Part 2, Chapter 5 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 2, Chapter 5, The Martyr. Miss Grigg came back to the office on a Thursday, and somewhat mysteriously. Millicent, no doubt from information received through Gertie Jackson, had been hinting for several days that the return would not be long delayed, but Mr. Grigg had said not one word about the matter until the Wednesday evening, when he told Lilian, with apparent casualness, as she was leaving for the night, that his sister might be expected the next morning. As for Miss Jackson, she would resume her duties only on the Monday, having family affairs to transact at Islington. Miss Jackson, it seemed, had developed into the trusted companion and intimate, almost ally, if the term were not presumptuous, of the soul and dynamo of the business. Miss Grigg and she had suffered together. They had solaced and strengthened each other, and Gertie, for all her natural humility, was henceforth to play in the office a role superior to that of a senior employee. She had already been endowed with special privileges, and among these was the privilege of putting the interests of Islington before the interests of Clifford Street. The advent of Miss Grigg, of course, considerably agitated the office, and in particular the small room, two of whose occupants had never seen the principal of whose capacity for sustained effort they had heard such wonderful and frightening tales. At 9:30 that Thursday morning it was reported in both rooms that Miss Grigg had re-entered her fortress. Nobody had seen her, but ears had heard her, and moreover it was mystically known by certain signs, as for example the reverse of a doormat which had been out of position for a week, that a higher presence was imminent in the place, and that the presence could be none other than Miss Grigg. Everybody became an exemplar of assiduity, amiability, and entire conscientiousness. Everybody prepared a smile, and there was a universal wish for the day to be over. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Miss Grigg visited the small room, shook hands with Lilian and Millicent, and permitted the two new typists to be presented to her. Millicent spoke first, and was so effusive in the expression of the delight induced in her by the spectacle of Miss Grigg, and of her sympathy for the past and hope for the future of Miss Grigg's health, that Lilian, who nevertheless did her best to be winning, could not possibly compete with her. Miss Grigg had a purified and chastened air, as of one detached by suffering from the grossness and folly of the world, and existing henceforth in the world solely from a cold, passionate sense of duty. Her hair was greyer, her mild, equable voice was soft, and her burning eyes had a brighter and more unearthly lustre. She said that she was perfectly restored, let fall that Mr. Grigg had gone away at her request for a short much-needed holiday, and then passed smoothly on to the large room. After a while a little flapper of a beginner came to tell Millicent that Miss Grigg wanted her. Millicent, who had had charge of the petty cash during the interregnum, was absent for 40 minutes. When she returned, flushed but smiling, to her expectant colleagues, she informed Lilian that Miss Grigg desired to see her at 12 o'clock. "I notice there's an account here under the name of Lord Mackworth," Miss Grigg began, having allowed Lilian to stand for a few seconds before looking up from the ledger and other books in which she was apparently absorbed. She spoke with the utmost gentleness, and fixed her oppressive deep eyes on Lilian's. "Yes, Miss Grigg? It hasn't been paid." "Oh!" Lilian, against an intense volition, began to blush. "Didn't you know?" "I didn't," said Lilian. "But you've been having something to do with the books during my absence?" "I did a little at first," Lilian admitted. "Then Mr. Grigg saw to them." "Miss Merislade tells me that you had quite a lot to do with them, and I see your handwriting in a number of places here." "I've had nothing to do with them for about 3 weeks. I should think at least 3 weeks, and of course I expected the bill would be paid by this time." "But you never asked?" "No, it had never occurred to me." This statement was inaccurate. Lilian had often wondered whether Lord Mackworth had paid his bill, but for some obscurely caused self-consciousness she had not dared to make any inquiry. She felt herself to be somehow mixed up with Lord Mackworth, and had absurdly feared that if she mentioned the name there might appear on the face or in the voice of the detestable Milly some sinister innuendo. "Miss Merislade tells me that she didn't trouble about the account, as she supposed it was your affair." "My affair?" exclaimed Lilian impulsively. It's no more my affair than anybody else's. She surmised in the situation some ingenious malevolence of the flat-breasted mischief-maker. But you did the work? Yes, it came in while I was on duty that night, and I did it at once. There was no one else to do it. Who brought it in? Lord Mackworth. Did you know him? Certainly not. I didn't know him from Adam. Never mind Adam, Miss Share, observed Miss Grigg genially. Has Lord Mackworth been in since? If he has, I've not seen him, Lilian answered defiantly. Miss Grigg's geniality exasperated her because it did not deceive her. I'm only asking for information, Miss Grigg said with a placatory smile. I see the copies were delivered at 6:30 in the morning. Who delivered the job? I did. Where? At his address. I dropped it into the letter-box on my way home after my night's work. I stayed here because somebody had to stay, and I did the best I could. I'm quite sure of that, Miss Grigg agreed. And, of course, you've been paid for all overtime, and there's been quite a good deal. We all do the best we can, at least I hope so. And you've never seen Lord Mackworth since? No? And you simply dropped the envelope into the letter-box? Yes. Didn't see Lord Mackworth that morning? Certainly not. By this time Lilian was convinced that Miss Grigg's intention was to provoke her to open resentment. She guessed also that Milly must have deliberately kept silence to her, Lilian, about the Mackworth account, in the hope of trouble on Miss Grigg's return, and that Milly had done everything she could that morning to ensure trouble. The pot had been simmering in secret for weeks. Now it was boiling over. She felt helpless and furious. You know, Miss Grigg proceeded, there's a rule in this office that night work must only be delivered by hand by the day staff the next day. If it's wanted urgently before the day staff arrives, the customer must fetch it. Excuse me, Miss Grigg, I never heard of that rule. Miss Grigg smiled again. Well, at any rate, it was your business to have heard of it, my dear. Everybody else knows about it. I told Mr. Grigg I was going to deliver it myself, and he didn't say anything. Please don't attempt to lay the blame on my brother. He is far too good-natured. Miss Grigg's gaze burned into Lilian's face, as with an enigmatic intonation she uttered these words. You did wrong, and I suppose you never heard either of the rules that new customers must always pay on or before delivery. Yes, I have, but I couldn't ask for the money at 6:30 in the morning, could I? And I couldn't tell him how much it would be before I'd typed it. Yes, you could, my dear, and you ought to have done. You could have estimated it and left a margin for errors. That was the proper course. And if you know anything about Lord Mackworth, you must know that his debts are notorious. I believe he's one of the fastest young men about town, and it's more than possible that that accounts a bad debt. But can't we send in the account again? Lilian weakly suggested. She was overthrown by the charge of fast living against Lord Mackworth, yet she had always in her heart assumed that he was a fast liver. I've just telephoned to 6A St. James's Street, and I needn't say that Lord Mackworth is no longer there, and they don't know where he is. You see what comes of disobeying rules. Lilian lifted her head. Well, Miss Grigg, the bill isn't so very big, and if you'll please deduct it from my wages on Saturday, I hope that will be the end of that. It was plain that the bewildered creature had but an excessively imperfect notion of how to be an employee. She had taken to the vocation too late in life. Miss Grigg put her hand to the support of her forehead, and paused. I can tolerate many things, said she with great benignity, but not insolence. I didn't mean to be insolent. You did. And I think you had better accept a week's notice from Saturday. No, on second thoughts, I'll pay your wages up to Saturday week now, and you can go at once. She smiled kindly. That will give you time to turn round. Oh, very well, if it's like that. Miss Grigg unlocked a drawer, and while she was counting the money, Lilian thought despairingly that if Mr. Grigg, or even if the nice Gertie, had been in the office, the disaster could not have occurred. Miss Grigg shook hands with her and wished her well. Where are you going to? It's not 1 o'clock yet, asked Millicent in the small room as Lilian silently unhooked her hat and jacket from the clothes cupboard. Out. What for? For Miss G, if you wanted to know. and she left. Except her clothes, not a thing in the office belonged to her. She had no lien, no attachment. The departure was as simple and complete as leaving a tube train. No word, no goodbye, merely a disappearance. End. Part 2, Chapter 5. Part 2, Chapter 6 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 2, Chapter 6, The Invitation. She walked a mile eastwards along Oxford Street before entering a tea shop in order to avoid meeting any of the girls, all of whom, except the very youngest and the very stingiest, distributed themselves among the neighbouring establishments for the absurdly insufficient snack called a lunch. Every place was full just after 1 o'clock, and crammed at 1:15. She asked for a whole meat pie instead of a half, for she felt quite unusually hungry. A plot, that was what it was. A plot against her, matured by Miss G. in a few minutes out of Milly's innuendos written to Gertie and spoken to Miss G. herself. And the reason of the plot was Miss G.'s spinsterish, passionate fear of a friendship between Felix Grigg and Lilian. Lilian was ready to believe that Miss G. had engineered the absence of both her brother and Gertie, so as to be free to work her will without the possibility of complications. If Miss G. hated her, she hated Miss G. with at least an equal fierceness, the fierceness of an unarmed victim. The injustice of the world staggered her. She thought that something ought to be done about it. Even Lord Mackworth was gravely to blame for not having paid his bill. Still, that detail had not much importance, because Miss G., deprived of one pretext, would soon have found another. After all that she, Lilian, had done for the office, to be turned off at a moment's notice, and without a character, for Miss G. would never give a reference, and Lilian would never ask for a reference. Never. Nor would she, nor could she, approach Felix Grigg, nor Gertie either. Perhaps Felix Grigg might communicate with her. He certainly ought to do so. But then he was very casual, forgetful, and unconsciously cruel. All the men and girls in the packed tea-shop had work behind them and work in front of them. They knew where they were. They had a function on the earth. She, Lilian, had nothing save a couple of weeks' wages and perhaps £100 in the post office savings bank. Resentment against her father flickered up anew from its ashes in her heart. How could she occupy herself after lunch? Unthinkable for her to go to her lodging until the customary hour, unless she could pretend to be ill. And if she feigned illness, the well-disposed slavey would be after her and would see through the trick at once, and it would be all over the house that something had happened to Miss Share. The afternoon was an enormous trackless expanse which had to be somehow traversed by a weary and terribly discouraged wayfarer. Her father had been in the habit of conducting his family on ceremonial visits to the public art galleries. She went to the Wallace collection, and saw how millionaires lived in the 70s, and how the unchaste and lovely ladies were dressed for whom entire populations were sacrificed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thence to a cinema near the Marble Arch, and saw how virtue infallibly wins after all. When, after travelling countless leagues of time and ennui, she reached home, she received a note from Mr. Pladder inviting her to the Hammersmith Palais de Danse for the following night. Mr. Pladder was the star lodger in the house, a man of 45, legally separated from his wife, but of impeccable respectability and decorum. His illusion was that he could dance rather well. Mr. Pladder was evidently coming on. The next morning, which was very fine, Lilian spent in Hyde Park, marshalling her resources. Beyond her trifling capital she had none. Especially, she had no real friends. She had unwisely cut loose from her parents' acquaintances, and she could not run after them now that she was in misfortune. Her former colleagues? Out of the question. Gertie might prove a friend, but Gertie must begin. Lilian could not begin. Lord Mackworth? Silly idea. She still thought of Lord Mackworth romantically. He was an unattainable hero at about the same level as before in her mind, for while his debts had lowered him, his advertised dissoluteness had mysteriously raised him. Yet in these hours and days Mr. Platter himself was not more absolutely respectable and decorous in mind and demeanour than Lilian. She went to 2 cinemas in the afternoon, and, safe in the darkness of the second one, cried silently. But with Mr. Platter at the Palais de Danse she was admirably cheerful, and Mr. Platter was exceedingly proud of his companion, who added refined manners to startling beauty. She delicately praised his dancing, whereupon he ordered lemon squashes and tomato sandwiches. At the little table she told him calmly that she was leaving her present situation and taking another. Back in her room she laughed with horrid derision, and as soon as she was in bed the clockwork mice began to run round and round in her head. A plot! A plot! What a burning shame! What a burning shame! A few weeks earlier she had actually been bestowing situations on pitiful applicants. Now she herself had no situation and no prospect of any. She had never had to apply for a situation. She had not been educated to applying for situations. She could not imagine herself ever applying for a situation. She had not the least idea how to begin to try to get a situation. She passed the greater part of Sunday in bed, and in the evening went to church and felt serious and good. On Monday morning she visited the post office and filled up a withdrawal form for £40. She had had a notion of becoming a companion to a rich lady, or private secretary to a member of Parliament. She would advertise. Good clothes, worn as she could wear them, would help her. She could not face another situation in an office. No, she couldn't. The notion of a simpleton, of course. But she was still a simpleton. The notion, however, was in reality only a pretext for obtaining some good clothes. All her life she desired more than anything a smart dress. There was never a moment in her life when she was less entitled to indulge herself, but she felt desperate. She was taking to clothes as some take to brandy. On the Wednesday she received the money. A colossal, a marvellous sum. She ran off with it and nervously entered a big shop in Wigmore Street. The shop was a wise choice on her part, for it combined smartness with the discreet and characteristic Englishness. Impossible to have the dangerous air of an adventuress in a frock bought at that shop. The next few days were spent in exactly fitting and adapting the purchases to her body. She had expended the £40 and drawn out 8 more. Through the medium of the slavey she borrowed a mirror and fixed it at an angle with her own so that she could see her back. She was so interested and absorbed that she now and then neglected to feel unhappy and persecuted. She neglected also to draw up an advertisement, postponing that difficult matter until the clothes should be finished. But the house gathered that Miss Share had got her new situation. One afternoon, early, returning home after a search for white elastic in Hammersmith, she saw Mr. Grigg coming away from the house. She stood still, transfixed. She flushed hotly, and descried a beneficent and just God reigning in heaven. She knew she was saved, and the revulsion in her was nearly overwhelming. A miracle! And yet not a miracle at all, for Mr. Grigg was bound by every consideration of honour and decency to get into communication with her sooner or later. Her doubts of his integrity had been inexcusable. "I've just left a note for you," he said, affecting carelessness. "I brought it down myself because I couldn't remember whether your number was 56 or 65, and I had to inquire. Moreover, it's urgent. I wanted to talk to you. Will you dine with me tonight at the Devonshire restaurant, Jermyn Street? 8 o'clock? I shan't be able to dress, so you could wear a hat. Yes or no?" He was gone again in a moment. Lilian literally ran upstairs to her room in order to be alone with her ecstatic happiness. She hugged it, kissed it, smothered it, then read the wonderful note 3 times, and reviewed all her new clothes. End of Part 2, Chapter 6. Part 2, Chapter 7 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 2, Chapter 7, The Avowal. As Lilian armed herself for the field, she discovered that, after all her care, she had omitted to provide several small details, the absence of each of which seemed for a few moments in turn to be a disaster. but on the whole she was well satisfied with the total effectiveness. The slattern, who had been furtively summoned, and who was made to wash her hands before touching a hook and eye, expressed, in whispers, an admiring amazement which enheartened Lilian in spite of its uninformed quality. The girl, as if bewitched, followed the vision down to the front door. "If it rains, you're ruined, miss," said the girl anxiously, glancing up into the heavy darkness where not a star was to be seen. "You ought to have an umbrella." Lilian shook her head. "It won't rain," she answered cheerfully. But as soon as she was fairly away from the house she felt, or thought she felt, a drop of rain, and seeing a taxi she impulsively hailed it, wishing to heaven the next instant that she had not been so audacious. For although twice with her father and mother she had ridden in taxis on very great occasions, she had never in her life actually taken one by herself. Her voice failed and broke as she said to the driver, "Devonshire Restaurant, Jermyn Street." But the driver was proficient in comprehension, and the Devonshire Restaurant in Jermyn Street seemed to be as familiar to him as Charing Cross Station. In the taxi she collected herself. She thought she was all right except for her lips. She knew that her lips ought to have been slightly coloured, but she thought she also knew what was the best lipstick, and she had not been able to get it in Hammersmith. As for her nails, she was glad that it had been impossible for her to tint them. She must remember that she was a typist, and though typists, and even discharged typists, generally held their lips to be crimson on state nights, they do not usually tint their nails, unless they have abandoned discretion. Lilian was glad when justifying rain began to fall. While she paid the driver at her destination, a commissionaire held a vast umbrella over her fragile splendour. Her legs literally shook as she entered the restaurant, exactly as once they had shaken in an air raid. Within was a rich, tiny little waiting-room with a view of the dining-room beyond. She hesitated awkwardly, for owing to the taxi she was nearly a quarter of an hour too early. A respectful attendant said, "Are you expecting anyone, madam?" "Yes." "What name, madam?" "Mr. Grigg." "Oh, yes, madam, his table is booked." She had sat down. She could now inspect herself in half a dozen large mirrors, and she almost ceased to fear for her appearance. It was her deportment and demeanour that now troubled her. In this matter she was disturbingly aware that she had both to unlearn and to learn. She looked through the glass partition into the restaurant. It was small but sumptuous, and empty of diners, save for a couple of women who were smoking and eating simultaneously. People, chiefly in couples, kept arriving and passing through the antechamber. She picked up a copy of What's On, pretending to study it, but studying the arrivals. Then she felt a man come in and glimpsed the attendant pointing to herself. Mr. Grigg could not entirely conceal his astonishment at the spartanness of her appearance. He had in fact not immediately recognized her. His surprised pleasure and appreciation gave her both pleasure and confidence. "I'm not late," he said, resuming rapidly his rather quizzical matter-of-factness. "No, I was too early." The attendant took Mr. Grigg's overcoat like a sacred treasure. He was shown to be in a dark blue suit, and they passed to the restaurant. Lilian thought, "Anyway, he can't think I've bought these clothes specially for this affair, because he only asked me this afternoon." The table reserved was in a corner. Lilian had a full view of the whole restaurant, while Mr. Grigg had a full view of nothing but Lilian. For a girl in Lilian's situation he was an ideal host, for the reason that he talked just as naturally, and in particular curtly, as if they had been at the office together. When a waiter, shackled in silver, approached with the wine list, he asked, "What wine do you prefer?" "Whatever you prefer," she replied with a prompt and delicious smile. "Oh, no," he protested, "that won't do at all. If a woman's given the choice, she ought to choose. She must submit ideas, at any rate. Otherwise we shall go wandering all through the wine list and finally settle on something neither of us wants." Lilian had learnt a little about wines. She had sipped often from the paternal glass, and also about good plain cooking. "Burgundy," she said. Without another word Mr. Grigg turned to the Burgundy page, and while he was selecting, Lilian took off her gloves and gazed timidly around. It was the silver table lamps, each glowing under a canopy of orange, that impressed her more than anything else. Seashore shoulders, bosoms, pearls, white shirt fronts, black backs. The room was still filling, all repeated in gilt mirrors. The manner of the numerous waiters corresponded to her notion of court chamberlains. This was the first high-class restaurant she had ever seen, and despite her nervousness she felt more at home in it, more exultingly happy in it, than anywhere before in all her existence. She passionately loved it, and her beauty seemed to increase in radiance. She liked to think that it was extremely costly. Compare it to the Palais de Danse, Mr. Platter, and the tomato sandwiches. Ah, it was the genuine article at last. She took surreptitious glances also at Mr. Grigg's bent face, and the face was so strange to her, though just the same as of old, that she might have been seeing it for the first time. The greatness, the enormity of the occasion frightened her. What were they doing together? And what in the future would they do together? Was he really and seriously attracted by her? Was she in love with him, or was it all a curious and dangerous deception? She had always understood that when one was in love, one knew definitely that one was in love, whereas she was sure of nothing whatever. Nevertheless, she was uplifted into a beatific, irrational, and reckless joy. Never had she felt as she felt while Mr. Grigg was selecting the Burgundy. "Now we'd better be getting to business," said he, when the hors d'oeuvre had been removed and the soup served. "I had a letter from my sister this morning. She wrote— Wait a minute." He pulled a letter from his pocket and read out, "I'm sorry to say I've been compelled to get rid of poor Lilian's share. She's a nice enough girl in her way, but when you're not here I'm in charge of this office, and as she couldn't treat me with the respect due to me, I had to decide at once what to do, and I did decide. I treated her generously, and I hope she'll soon get another place. She will, of course, because she can be so very attractive, when she likes," underlined, "but I fear she isn't likely to keep it unless she changes her style of behaviour." He smacked the letter together and returned it to his pocket. "There, you see, I've been remarkably frank with you. I came up from Brighton on purpose to tell you, and I'm going back by the last train tonight. My sister is quite unaware of this escapade. In fact, at the moment I'm leading a double life. Now, I'm giving you one version of this mighty incident. Give me your version." Lilian, troubled, looked at her mother's engagement ring on her finger, the sole jewel she carried, and smiled with acute restraint at her plate. "Have you got another situation?" "I suppose not," Mr. Grigg went on. "No, not yet." "Have you tried for one?" "No." "Then what are you about?" "Oh, my father left me a little money, very little, but I'm not starving." "So I should judge. Well, tell me all about it." "I didn't mean to be rude to her, really I didn't. It was all about a small bill of Lord Mackworth's." She related the episode in detail, repeating the conversation with marvellous exactitude, but with too many she said, and I said. Mr. Grigg laughed when she came to the offer to pay the bill herself, and after a moment she gave a slight responsive smile. She was very careful not to make, or even to imply, the least charge against Miss Grigg, and she accomplished the duplicity with much skill. "I can promise you one thing," said Mr. Grigg. "The moment I get back I'll see that Milly is sacked. I cannot stick that bag of bones." "Please don't." "You don't want me to?" Lilian shook her head slowly. "All right, then, I won't. Now I'll tell you the whole business in a nutshell. My sister's a great woman. She's perfectly mad, but she's a great woman. Only where I'm concerned she's always most monstrously unscrupulous. I'm her religion. Always was, but more than ever since I bought that amusing business. She was dying of boredom. It saved her. When I got myself divorced she was absolutely delighted. She had me to herself again. Her jealousy where I'm concerned is ferocious. She can't help it, but it's ferocious. Tigresses aren't in it with her. She was jealous of you, and she determined to clear you out. I perceived that for a long time." "But why should she be jealous of me? I'm sure I've never—" "Well, she's damned clever, Isabel is, and she's seen that I'm in love with you. Gone. Far gone." He spoke with strange detachment, as of another person. The thud of Lilian's heart appalled her. She blushed down to her neck, Her hand shook. The restaurant and all its inhabitants vanished in a cloud, and then slowly reappeared. Her confusion of mind was terrible. She was shocked, outraged by the negligently brutal candour of the Yuval, and at the same time she was thinking, "I had no idea that any man was as marvellous as this man is, and I don't think there can possibly be another man quite as marvellous anywhere. And his being in love with me is the most ravishing, lovely, tender thing that ever happened to any girl. And of course he is in love with me. He's not pretending. He would never pretend." She wanted to be unconscious for a little while. She did not know it, but her beautiful face was transfigured by the interplay of shyness, modesty, soft resentment, gratitude, ecstasy, and determination. Her head was bowed, and she could not raise it. Neither could she utter a single word. She looked divine, and thought she looked either silly or sulky. Mr. Grigg glanced aside. A glimpse of paradise had dazzled the eternal youth in him. The waiter bore away the soup plates. "Perhaps that's enough about business for the present," said Mr. Grigg at length. "Let's talk about something else. But before we start, I must just tell you you're the most stylish creature in this restaurant. I was staggered when I came in and saw you. Staggered." She did raise her head. "Why?" she asked with exquisite gentleness. Mr. Grigg, overwhelmed, offered no response. As for her determination, it amounted to this: "I will be as marvellous as he is. I will be more marvellous. I will be queen, slave, everything. He doesn't guess what is in store for him." She did not think about the difference in their ages, nor about marriage, nor did she even consider whether or not she was in love with him. Chiefly, she was grateful, and what she saw in front of her was a sublime vocation. Her mood was ever so faintly tinged with regret, because they were not both in evening dress. End of Part 2, Chapter 7. Part 2, Chapter 8 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 2, Chapter 8, Philosophy of the Grey-Haired. The evening and all Lilian's emotions seemed to start afresh. The look of the restaurant was changed. The tables had been cleared of the grosser apparatus of eating, and showed white cloths with only white plates, fruit, small glasses, small cups, ashtrays. Most of the waiters had vanished. The remainder stood aside, moveless, inobtrusive, watchful. The diners had abandoned themselves to intimacy, or the sweet coma of digestion. Some talked rather loudly, others in a murmur. Women leaned back or put their elbows on the table, letting cigarette smoke float upwards across their eyes. A few tables were already deserted, and the purity of their emptiness seemed bafflingly to demonstrate that events may happen and leave behind absolutely no trace. Without consulting Lilian, Mr. Grigg gave an order, and 2 small glasses were slowly filled to the brim with a green liquid. Lilian recognized it for the very symbol of their delicate license. She was afraid to sip, lest she might be disillusioned concerning it, and also lest the drinking of it might malignly hasten the moment of departure of the last train for Brighton. Mr. Grigg was of those who murmured. His wrists lay one over the other on the table, and his face was over the table, and it seemed strange, so low and even was his speech, that Lilian could catch every word as she did. The people at the next table could have heard nothing. All the animation and variety were in his features, none in his tone. He had been telling her about Brighton. He saw the town of Brighton as a living, developing whole, discussing it as a single organism, showing how its evolution was still in active process, and making the small group of men who were exploiting it and directing it appear like creative giants, and the mass of inhabitants like midgets, utterly unconscious of their own manipulation. And in his account of the vast affair there was no right and no wrong. There were merely the dark aims and the resolution of the giants determined to wax in power and to imprint themselves on the municipality. Lilian had never heard such revealing talk. She could not follow all of it, but she was fascinated, wonderstruck, profoundly impressed by the quality of the brain opposite to her, and the contemptibleness of her own ignorance of life, amazed and enraptured that this brain could be interested in herself. Mr. Grigg related the story of the middle-aged proprietor of one of the chief hotels who had married a young wife. He'd broken up his family, and the family is the real unit of society, and there was no need for it, no need at all. But then, you see, he never had time in his existence to understand that a middle-aged man who has already had experience of marriage and marries a girl young enough to be his daughter is either a coward or a fool or without taste. He would only do it because he's mad for her, and that's the very reason for not doing it. When romance comes in that way, it wants the source of secrecy and plotting, the double life, and so on. The feeling of naughtiness is simply a marvellous feeling. You must sometimes have guessed that, haven't you? Perversity, doing society in the eye, it's a continual excitement. Of course, it needs cleverness on both sides. You haven't got to be clumsy over it. The woman runs risks, but nothing to the risks she'd run in marriage. And if the thing dies out in her and they haven't been clumsy, she's free as air to start again. She's got her experience gratis, and there's a mysterious flavour about her that's nearly the most enticing flavour on earth. Naturally, people will talk. Let 'em. No harm in rumour. In fact, the more rumour the better. He went on with no pause. You've not looked at me for about 5 hours. Look at me now and tell me you're disgusted. Tell me you're frightened. She lifted her eyes and gazed at him for a few seconds, not smiling. Her skin tingled and crept. Then she sipped the crème de menthe, and at first it tasted just like water. A woman wants making. Only a man can make a woman. She has to be formed. She can't do it herself. A young man may be able to do it, but he's like a teacher who swots up the night before what he has to teach the next day. And he's a fearful bungler besides being cruel, unconsciously. Whereas an older man, a much older man, he knows. It's a unique chance for both of them. She has so much to give, and she has so much to learn. It's a fair bargain. Perhaps the woman has a little the best of it, because after all she loses nothing that it isn't her business to lose, and the man, well, he may kill himself. And the chance for a clever girl to be made without any clumsiness, what a chance! Well, I don't say which of them has the best of it. I'm speaking impartially. If you live to be as old as Ninon Deslors, you'll never meet a more honest man than I am. Lilian felt intoxicated, but not with the burgundy, nor with the crème de menthe. Rather with sudden fresh air. She thought, be careful. Be careful, you aren't yourself. Something queer's come over you. She was not happy. She was alarmed. Once before she had been alarmed by herself, but this time she was really alarmed. She was glad that she had always despised boys of her own age. What did Mr. Grigg mean by saying that a man might kill himself? She didn't know. Yes, she knew. She saw clearly that a woman must be formed by a man, and that until she was formed, she would not be worthy of herself. She longed ardently to be formed. As she stood, she was futile. She could exercise no initiative, make use of no opportunities, and her best wisdom was to remain negative, in order to avoid mistakes. Something that looked like a woman, but wasn't one. She had the intelligence to realize how insipid she was. Ambition surged through her anew and with fresh power. Mr. Grigg drove her home, and the taxi was a little dark, vibrating room in which they were alone together and safe from all scrutiny. She was painfully constrained. "Yes," said Mr. Grigg, after an interminable silence. "My sister was quite right." "What about?" Lilian asked in a child's voice. "I'm in love. What are you going to do about it?" He turned his head impulsively towards her, gazed at her in the dim twilight of the taxi, and then kissed her. In spite of herself she yearned to give, and the yearning thrilled her. "Please, please," she murmured in modest, gentle, passive protest. Another pause. "I shall write to you tomorrow," he said. "In the meantime, believe me, you're entirely marvellous." He was looking straight in front of him at the driver's shaggy shoulders. That was all that occurred, except the handshake. When she let herself into the house, the servant was just going upstairs to bed, after her usual 16-hour day. "So you're back, miss?" "No," thought Lilian. "It's somebody else that's come back. The girl you mean will never come back. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Part 3, Chapter 1 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 1, In the Hotel. Felix came quietly through the communicating door into Lilian's shuttered and closed room. Between the two bedrooms was a bathroom. All the bedrooms in the hotel seemed to be designed on the same plan, too high, too long, too narrow, with the head of the bed behind the door and directly facing the window. A wardrobe, a dressing table, a washstand, a writing table, an easy chair under the window, 2 cane chairs, a night table, and 2 electric lights so devilishly arranged that they could not be persuaded to burn simultaneously. A carpet, overgrown with huge gorgeous flowers, and the walls overgrown with huge gorgeous flowers of another but equally mirific plant. Outside the bedroom a bell rang at short intervals. All the guests in the neighbourhood performed, according to their idiosyncrasies, on the same bell, and slippered feet of servants rushing to and fro in the corridor shook the planks of Lilian's floor as they passed. Amid the obscurity of the room, Lilian's curved form, lying heaped on its side, and rather like a miniature mountain that sloped softly down towards the head and towards the feet, could be vaguely deciphered in the bed, and hillocks of attire, some pale, others coloured, some fragile and diaphanous, others resistant to the world's peering, lay dimly about on chairs and even on the writing-table. The air, exhausted by the night, had a faint and delicate odour that excited, but did not offend, Felix's nostrils. "Is it time to get up?" Lilian murmured in the voice of a sleepy child. "No." Her brain slowly came to life. Flitting in and out of her happiness there were transient apprehensions, not about the morality, but about the security of her situation. They disappeared, all except one, as soon as she looked firmly at them, because she had the most perfect confidence in Felix's good faith. The unity of the pair had begun in London, under conditions provided by Felix, who, however, did not care for them, and who had decided that he would take her away for a holiday, in order that they might both reflect upon and discuss at length the best method of organizing a definite secret existence. It was during the preliminaries to the departure that she had been specially struck by his straightforwardness. He would have no wangling with passports. She must travel as herself. She could think of no acquaintance qualified to sign the application for her passport. It was Felix's suggestion that she should go to the Putney doctor who had attended her father and mother. The pair had travelled separately on the same train de luxe, for which, with Felix's money, she bought her own ticket. The cost of the ticket and the general expensiveness of the purchases which Felix insisted on her making had somewhat frightened her. He reassured her by preaching the relativity of all things. "You must alter your scale. It needs only an effort of the imagination," he had said, and explained to her his financial status. She learned that he had an independent income, and his sister another, though much smaller, independent income, and that the typewriting business was a diversion, though a remunerative one. Also that an important cash bonus, just received from an insurance policy, enabled him to be profuse without straining his ordinary resources. She had trembled at the reception office of the great hotel, but Felix, laughing at her fears, accomplished all formalities for her quite openly, and indeed the discreet incuriosity of the hotel officials fully confirmed the soundness of his attitude. Ignoring the description on the passport, he had told her to sign as Madame, and he threw out negligently that she was his cousin. This was his sole guile. Before going upstairs he had written out a telegram and shown it to her. It was to his sister, to say that he had arrived safely and sent his love. "She has to be deceived," he murmured, "but she's got to be treated decently. It was all I could do to keep her from coming to see me off at Victoria." He smiled. Lilian was impressed. When Lilian found that Felix's bedroom stood next to her bathroom, her anxieties were renewed. Felix laughed again, and rang, for the door between the bathroom and his bedroom was locked. In a few minutes a dark and stoutish chambermaid entered with a pleasant, indulgent, comprehending gravity, and unlocked the door. "What is your name?" he asked. "Jacqueline, monsieur," she replied, and cordially accepted a 20-franc note from him. It was all so simple, so natural, so un-English, so enheartening. In 2 hours they had settled down. All the embarrassing preludes to the closest intimacy had been amply achieved in London. Lilian stretched herself voluptuously, murmured with a magnificent yawn, "Ah, how I have slept!" and slipping out of bed, padded unshod up the room to Felix, who sat passive in the easy-chair. She took the bearings of his shape in the gloom, and dropped lightly onto his knees. "What am I sitting on?" she exclaimed, startled. "My newspapers." Touched by the fact that he had been waiting to read his beloved papers until she should be ready to rise, she threw her arms passionately round his neck and crushed her face into his. Daily it became clearer to her that he adored her, and yet she could scarcely believe it, because she felt so young, even childish, and so crude and insipid. She determined with a whole-souled resolve that renewed itself every hour to stop at nothing to please him. "Do I make you happy?" she whispered almost inarticulately, her lips being buried in his cheek. "You do." After a moment she sprang up, seized her thin, loose, buttonless dressing-gown, and, having somehow got into it, opened the window and violently pushed back the shutters. Strong sunlight rushed blazing into the room like an army into a city long besieged and at last fallen. Millions of buoyant motes were revealed, and all the minutest details of the chamber. Lilian looked out. There were the shady gardens of the hotel, the white promenade with strolling visitors in pale costumes, the calm ultramarine Mediterranean, the bandstand far to the right emitting inaudible music, the yellow casino, beyond the casino the jetty with its group of white yachts, and, distant on either side, noble and jagged mountains, some of them snow-capped. Incredible! She heard Felix moving within the room and turned her head. "Darling, what are you doing?" "Ringing for your coffee." "What time is it?" "Haven't the least." "But your watch?" "Haven't got it on." "But you're all dressed." "Haven't put things in my pockets." She clasped his arm and led him silently through the bathroom into his own bedroom and up to the night-table, the drawer of which she pulled open. All his things were ranged carefully therein. "Oh, men are funny," she laughed. The number and the variety of the articles they carried in their innumerable pockets. "I will put your things in your pockets," she said, and began to do so. "Wrong," he would protest from time to time, but he would give no positive direction, and she had to discover the pocket by experiment. It was a most wonderful operation, and it deliciously illustrated the exotic, incomprehensible, exquisite curiousness of men. She was proud of having thought of it, and proud of the pleasure in his face. As she glanced at the watch, her brow puckered. "I shall be frightfully late." "It is impossible to be late where time does not exist." "Is that Jacqueline with my coffee?" she said, listening, and ran back to her room, pulling him after her. Yes, she admitted she was a perfect child, but she could not help it. While she drank the coffee, he put on his eyeglasses and opened the newspapers, one English, one French. She went into the bathroom. "Felix, Felix," she called presently from the bathroom, "bring me in that soft towel I've left on the chair by the writing-table." Then she returned to the bedroom and did her abundant, glossy chestnut hair, and by innumerable small stages dressed. He was reading his papers, but she knew that he was also watching her, and she loved him to watch her dress, from the first stage to the last. She was too young to have anything to conceal, and his pleasure, which he tried to mask, was so obvious. He dropped the Times and turned to the French paper. "Felix, do you know what?" "What?" "I'm frightfully ashamed of not being able to speak French. If I could only speak it a quarter as well as you do." "That's nothing. I couldn't say 2 words without a Frenchman knowing instantly that I wasn't French." "But you can talk it so quickly. Couldn't I have someone in here every morning to teach me for an hour? People do. I could get up earlier." "Certainly not," Felix replied. "If you did, you'd have something to be late for. You bring time into existence and spoil everything. Besides, learning French is hard work. You wouldn't learn it by instinct, as you learn clothes. And you aren't here for hard work. Learn French by all means, but not in this place. London's the place for hard work. Exercise your sense of the fitness of things, my clever girl. She did not fully understand this philosophy, but she accepted it admiringly. What dress would you like me to wear, darling? She was at the wardrobe. That white one. Then I shall have to change my stockings. Well, the yellow one then. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters, she said with earnestness, sitting down religiously, fanatically, to change her stockings. Don't you know that I don't want anything in the world except to please you? I only wanted to learn French so you shouldn't have to be ashamed of me. End of Part 3, Chapter 1. Part 3, Chapter 2 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 2. The Big Yacht. After lunching to music beneath a vast parasol in the hotel gardens, which looked like a tented field, they were bowed away by servitors in black and white, and bowed into the hotel by servitors in blue and gold, and bowed along the central artery of the hotel by apprentice servitors in scarlet, and bowed out of the hotel again onto the promenade by servitors in blue and gold. It was 2:30. The glorious sun was already slipping down. They had done absolutely nothing, and yet they had not wasted a moment. And on the faces of all the many-coloured servitors there was the smiling assurance that they had been admirably exerting themselves in full correctness, and had not a moment to waste if they honestly desired to pursue idleness as idleness ought to be pursued. Indeed, the winter day was too short for the truly conscientious. "Your little fur?" exclaimed Felix, who was wearing his overcoat. He stopped. "But, darling, I'm far too hot as it is." "In an hour the day will be gone," said he, and insisted on the treachery of the climate. He frequently insisted on the treachery of the climate. If he happened to cough ever so slightly, he would say that the entire Riviera was bad for the throat, and that a sore throat was the most dangerous complaint known to man. Lilian indulgently thought him fussy about her health, and his own, and the awful menaces of the exquisite climate, but she did not attribute his fussiness to his age. She regarded him as merely happening to be a bit fussy on certain matters. Nor did she regret the fussiness, for it gave her new occasions to please him, and, in her heart, to condescend femininely towards him. "I shan't need it." "Please, I'll fetch it, and I'll carry it. No, you stay here." "But do you know where it is, Felix?" "I know where it is." His voice had become very firm and somewhat tyrannic. She stood on the pavement, put up her orange sunshade, and mused contentedly upon his prodigious care for her, proof of his passionate attachment. People were passing in both directions all the time on the broad digue beyond the roadway. Some strolled in complete possession of idleness. Others hurried after it with tools such as tennis rackets to help them. Nearly all, men and women, stared at her as they passed, until at length she turned round and faced the revolving door of the hotel. "Oh, thank you, dearest. You're spoiling me horribly. Do let me take it." "I will not. Of course I am spoiling you. That is what you're here for. Your highest duty in life is to be spoiled. Let's go on the mole." They set off. A dark man, overdressed in striped flannels, nearly stood still at the sight of Lilian, gazing at her as though he had paid 5 francs for the right to do so. "My goodness," she muttered, "how they do stare here." "Why grudge them harmless enjoyment?" Felix observed. "You're giving pleasure to every man that looks at you, and envy to most of the women. You're fulfilling a very valuable function in the world. If anyone is justified in objecting, I am, and I don't object. On the contrary, I am as proud of the staring as if I created you. There's nothing to beat you on this coast, with your ingenuous English style of beauty, and half the pretty women here would sell their souls to look as innocent as you look. Believe me." Lilian said nothing in reply. The fact was that the man simply could not open his mouth without giving her more to think about than she could manage. At the quay they examined all the yachts, big and little, that were moored stern on, side by side. There were 3 large steam yachts, and the largest of the 3, with 2 decks and a navigating deck, all white and gold and mahogany and bunting and flowers and fluttering awnings, overpoweringly dominated the port. Felix stopped and stared at the glinting enormity. "Is that only a yacht?" Lilian cried. "Why, it's bigger than the Channel steamer." "No," said Felix, "but she's the fourth largest yacht in the world. That's the celebrated Kita. Crew of 80-odd. She came in last night for stores, and she's leaving again tonight, going to Naples. And here are the stores, you may depend." A lorry loaded with cases of wine drove up. "But it's all like a fairy tale," said Lilian. "Yes, it is. And so are you. You see, the point is that she's just about the finest of her kind. And so are you. She costs more than you to run, of course. A machine like that can't be run on less than £1,000 a week. Come along. Who's staring now?" £1,000 a week!" Lilian murmured aghast. Her imagination resembled that of a person who, on reaching a summit which he has taken for the top of the ridge, sees far higher peaks beyond. And the conviction that those distant peaks were unobtainable saddened her for a moment. "It's absolutely awful." "Why awful? If you have the finest, you must pay for it. 1,000 a week's nothing to that fellow. Moreover, he's a British citizen, and he did splendid service for his country in the war. Among other things, he owns 2 of the best brands of champagne. The War Office gave him a commission and a car, and he travelled all over Europe selling his own champagne at his own price to officers' messes. After all, officers couldn't be expected to fight without the drinks they're accustomed to, could they?" Lilian obscurely divined irony. She often wished that she could be ironical and amusing as Felix was, but she never could. She couldn't conceive how it was done. They reached the mole, which was quite deserted, being off the map of correctness, and surveyed the entire scene. Ships, blue water, white hotels, casino, villas, green wooded slopes, all faint in the haze, and rising sharply out of the haze, the lofty line of snow. In the immediate foreground, almost under their feet, was a steel collier from the north. Along the whole length of the ship carts were drawn up, and cranes were creaking, and grimy, ragged men hurried sweating to drop basketfuls of coal into the carts, and full carts were always departing, and empty carts always coming. The activity seemed breathless, feverish, and without the possibility of end. So huge was the steamer, and so small were the pair-horse carts. 2 yachts' officers passed in shiny blue with gilt buttons and facings. Growled one. "Yes, and how the hell do they expect me to keep my ship clean with this thing between me and the weather?" "Yes," agreed the other. "How in hell do they? Why they don't make 'em unload somewhere else beats me." Then Felix and Lilian turned seawards and watched the everlasting patience of the fishers on the rocks below. "Better put your fur on," said Felix suddenly. She put it on. Returning to the quay, Lilian could not keep her eyes off the superb yacht. But in a moment she bent them suddenly and quickened her pace. "You're feeling chilly," said Felix triumphantly. "The sun's got behind the fort." On the lower deck of the yacht, under an awning and amid easy-chairs and cushions, she had seen a tall man earnestly engaged in conversation with a young and pretty girl. She thought the man was Lord Mackworth. She felt sure it was Lord Mackworth. She wanted to turn her head and make certain, but she dared not, lest he should see her. She was blushing. There was nothing whatever in the brief relations between Lord Mackworth and herself to which the slightest exception could be taken by the strictest moralist. Yet she was blushing. She blushed because of the dreams she had once had concerning him. Her old forgotten thoughts, which nobody on earth could have guessed, made her into a kind of criminal. It was very strange. Perhaps also she feared a little what Lord Mackworth might think of her if he saw her in that place, in those clothes, with a man much older than herself. How inexpressibly fortunate that the yacht was leaving that night! Instead of looking over her shoulder at Lord Mackworth, she looked over her shoulder at Felix, to reassure herself about her deep fondness for him, and about his reliability in even the greatest crises. "I love him," she reflected, "because he is so marvellously clever and kind and dependable and just, and because he worships me. I don't know why." But she was devoted to him because he had picked her out of a batch and opened her eyes to the apple on the tree and made her eat it, and because she had worked and watched and suffered for him in the office, and been cast out of the office for him, and because of a funny, enigmatic look in his wrinkled eyes. She would have liked him just the same if he had been cruel and undependable and had not worshipped her. and she desired ardently to be still more and more beautiful and luxurious for him, and more to be stared at for him, and to render him still happier and happier. She was magnificently ready to kill him with bliss. After several hundred yards she turned round and looked at the yacht. No figures were distinguishable now on the deck. She thought captiously, "I wonder who that doll was, and what they were talking about with their heads so close together." End of Part 3, Chapter 2. Part 3, Chapter 3 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 3. The Casino. Lilian, in a negligee, was somnolently stretched out in the easy chair in her room when Felix peeped in. He looked at her inquiringly in silence for a moment, and she gave him a hazy smile. "Oh," he said, "then you won't feel like going into the casino tonight after all?" "Nothing to stop me," she replied, with a peculiar intonation, light and yet anxious. "Hurrah!" exclaimed Felix very gaily, almost boyishly. "Then we'll go." The apprehension which now for 2 days had been eating like a furtive cancer into her mind suddenly grew and contaminated the whole of her consciousness. She could not understand his levity, for she had not concealed from him the sinister misgiving. "Yes," she murmured with a sort of charming and victimized protest, "that's all very well, but—" And she stopped, and the smile expired from her face. He shrugged his shoulders, gave a short, affectionate, humouring laugh, and said with kind superiority, utterly positive, "What have I told you? The thing's absolutely impos." And just as suddenly she was quite reassured, and the apprehension vanished away. It could not exist against his perfect certitude. She lit up a new smile. "Look here," he went on, "we'll dine in the casino if we can. Of course, every blessed table may be booked, but I'll have a try." A quarter of an hour later, when she had begun to dress, he returned with the exciting information that, at precisely the right instant, somebody had telephoned to countermand an inside table, and he had secured it. They arrived very late in the casino restaurant, yet more diners came after them than had come before, so that ultimately it would have been difficult to draw a straight line between dinner and supper. The stars in the arched firmament of the vast and lofty hall challenged the stars of heaven in number and splendour, and seemed to win easily. Light fell in glittering floods on the flowered tables and on the shoulders of the women. In the centre of the floor was an oblong parquet sacred to dancing. The band, in which Englishmen and varied Dagos were mingled, sat, clothed apparently in surplices, on a dais in a mighty alcove. The drummer and the banjoist each procured an unnatural union of light and sound by electric illumination of their instruments from within. The leader wore a battered opera hat, and at the end of a piece he would exclaim grimly and scornfully, "So that's that," or "We are the goods," or some such phrase. Now and then the band overflowed into song, and the wild chants of the Marquesas or the Fiji Islands ran riotously through the correctness of the restaurant, and Lilian caught fragments of significant verse, such as "The rich get rich and the poor get children, ain't we got fun?" showing that one touch of nature makes the southern archipelago the very sister and bride of Europe. The primary mission of the band was to induce a general exultant gaiety, and the mission was accomplished. Nobody understood how. Lilian exulted in the food, the wine, the glitter, the noise, the wise humorous face of Felix, and the lances which assailed her on every hand. All care fell away from her. She forgot the future, and the whole of her vitality concentrated itself intensely in the moment. Most of the conversation at neighbouring tables was in English, and it was all about gambling, dancing, golf, lawn tennis, polo, cards, racing, trains de luxe, clothes, hotels, prices, and women. Even in the incomprehensible French gabble that reached her, she could distinguish words like golf, and bridge, and picnic. Then 4 elegant wasted young men appeared mysteriously from nowhere, and approached certain tables, and bowed with an assured air, and instantly 4 elegant young women rose up, without being asked, and the professional couples began to display to the amateurs the true art of the dance. Lilian had never seen such dancing. "Why are they all Spanish girls?" she innocently asked, struck by the rich, dark skin of the women. "They're no more Spanish than you are," said Felix. "You perceive that one there? She's at our hotel, on our floor, and I've seen her as blonde as a Norwegian. The dark olive is the result of strange cosmetics, and a jolly fine result too. Nothing finer has been invented for a century. It's so perverse. Don't you like it?" "I think it's lovely," she agreed with enthusiasm, also with a vague envy. Later, when the señoritas had left their partners and resumed their interrupted meals, and the parquet was empty again, she said, "I do really think it's awful, all this. It's so expensive, everything. And it's all for pleasure. The whole town's for pleasure." In the background she had a vision of her working life, with its discipline and cast-iron hours and wristlets and fatigue and privations and penury. The click of the typewriter, the green-shaded lamps, the tube, the cold bedroom, the washing and sewing done in the cold bedroom, the blue working frock with its pathetic red line of clumsy embroidery. "What about Margate?" Felix demanded quietly. She was nonplussed. "Oh, but that's different." "It is. It's not half as good. You must remember there's nothing new in all this. It's been going on in the Mediterranean for thousands of years, and it's likely to go on for thousands of years more. It's what human nature is. What are you going to do about it? Would you abolish luxury and pleasure? Not you. Do you imagine that God created the shores of the Mediterranean and this climate for anything else but this? What frightens you is the tremendous organization and concentration of the affair, nothing else. And let me tell you that this town is the most interesting town on the coast just now. The fellow that's got the new concession for the casino is a bit of a genius. He's moulding the place into something fresh. It used to be the primmest place on earth. He discovered that the English don't want to be prim any more. He showed them to themselves. Do you suppose all these women began to come here on their own? They're pawns in his great game. He brought them. But no nice-minded person asks how, nor whether they really pay for their meals or their rooms, nor how they manage to encourage big gambling in the baccarat rooms. This fellow has put the wind up to the next town up the coast. It used to be the most corrupt town in the whole of Europe, that place used to be. And now the rival genius there is introducing large families of children and nurses there, in the hope of persuading the English that they prefer to be prim and domestic after all. The fact is, these two geniuses are gambling against one another for far bigger stakes than any of the baccarat maniacs. It's a battle for the command of the coast, that's what it is. You don't get the hang of it all at once, but you will in time. Let's dance." Lilian was startled by the invitation, for they had not yet danced together. She remembered how, on that night when he first talked to her about herself, he had known that she was being deprived of an evening's dancing. They stood up as the chicken was being removed. She smiled at him with fresh admiration. He had impregnated her with new ideas. He had reassured her. He had justified her enjoyment. He was amazing. He was mad about her in his restrained style. And now he would surprisingly dance with her. Although they took the floor early in the dance, when only two other couples had begun to dance, it was impossible for her to be nervous within his arm. Half the room gazed at her, for she had attracted attention from the first. She knew that half the room was gazing at her, and she liked it. She guessed that half the room was saying, "Look at that fresh young creature who's with that middle-aged man. She must be really very young." And she liked it. She liked to show herself with the man who was more than old enough to be her father, worn by knowledge and experience and the corrupting of the world, to contrast her untried simplicity, the bloom of the virginal scarcely gone from it, with his grey hairs and his wrinkled, disillusioned, passive eyes. She was happy in the thought that everybody knew that she must have given herself to him, and that there was something strange, sinister, and even odious in her abandonment. He had used the word perverse. She did not wholly understand the word, but it appealed to her, and for her it expressed her mood. She had noticed in the room how the women no longer unquestionably young were more consciously and carefully charming towards their men, receiving adulation but rendering it back, whereas the unquestionably young were more negligent and far more egotistic. and so she behaved like one no longer unquestionably young. She glanced up at her partner with ravishing, ecstatic smiles. She publicly adored him. And she was glad that her green and gold frock with its long armholes was not of the Wigmore Street cut, but quite other in origin and spirit, and in its effect upon the imagination. The dancing had by this time become general, but the olive-tinted temptresses were still prominent in the throng, and sometimes she touched them in the curves of the dance. She knew where they beat her, and where she beat them, and it was vouchsafed to her from the eyes of Felix that she was lovely and marvellous. She felt intensely, inexpressibly happy, and more than happy, triumphant. Her quiet, obstinate resentment against the domestic policy of her father died out, and she forgave him as she danced. She thought, with a secret sigh almost painful in its relief, "Thank God I have fulfilled myself, and succeeded not too late." She had premonitions of power, a foretaste of dominion. Felix was hers. She could influence him. She could remake him. And for the thousandth time she breathed to him in her soul, "I have made you happy, but I will make you more happy, infinitely more happy. You don't yet know what I am capable of." He danced, very correctly, quite nicely, rather stiff, of course, but with a certain clever abandonment of his body to the rhythm. She thought, with what women did he learn to dance? He must have danced a lot. Never will I ask, never. The foxtrot ended. As they were crossing the floor to their table, she saw Lord Markworth dining with a man older than himself at a table near the windows. She sat down to the sweet. He had caught sight of her, and was looking at her fixedly. She stared at him for a moment with the casually interested stare of non-recognition, perfectly executed. "The yacht hasn't left then, after all," she reflected. And to Felix, "Did that big yacht leave tonight?" "No," said Felix. "I heard they'd changed their minds." Felix had the faculty of hearing everything. In spite of herself, Lilian was disturbed. End of Part 3, Chapter 3. Part 3, Chapter 4 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 4, Chemin de Fer. When Felix said that of course they must visit the baccarat rooms, she vaguely acquiesced. A mood of the old apprehension had mysteriously succeeded her exultation. She wanted to exercise it, and couldn't. She would have tried to dance the gloom away, but Felix did not suggest another dance. She understood that he had danced once because it was proper for an enlightened amateur of life to forego no sensation, and that he would not dance again unless asked. She would not ask. He had given her a cigarette and a liqueur. She had accepted a second liqueur, and then declined it, afraid of it and anxious for her reputation in his eyes. There were formalities to accomplish at the entrance to the baccarat rooms, forms to be filled up, and money to be paid. "They make a small charge for emptying your pocket," said Felix. "They pretend to be rather particular about their victims." The select rooms were crowded. Every table in the blazing interior had round it a thick ring of sitters and standers, and many people were walking to and fro, disappointed or hopeful. By tiptoeing and supporting herself on Felix's shoulder, Lilian could just see the green cloth of a table, like the floor of a pit whose walls were bodies elegant in evening dress. It was littered with white, rose, and green counters, banknotes, cards, ashtrays, cigarette cases, and vanity bags. More women were seated than men. A single croupier dominated and ruled the game. Cards and counters were thrown about from side to side. "It seems frightfully exciting," murmured Lilian, scarcely audible, into the ear of Felix. "It is," said Felix gruffly. "It's the real thing, you know, gambling is. When people lose, they lose real money, and when they win, ditto. You can genuinely ruin yourself here. There's no sham about it. You may go out without even your fare home." He offered these remarks separately, between considerable pauses. "Is baccarat easy to learn?" "Very, but not here. And this isn't baccarat. This is chemin de fer. Equally easy, though. I'll get a pack of cards at the hotel and teach you. It's chemin de fer at every table. I suppose that's why they call the rooms baccarat." He was edging nearer the croupier. A stout middle-aged woman whose flesh seemed to be insecurely and inadequately confined within frail silk rose from her chair, gathering up a bag and cigarette case, all that remained to her. "Sit down here and keep the chair for me," Felix said sharply, and pushed Lilian into the seat. Everybody gazed at her, and her constraint showed the conviction that everybody guessed she had never sat at a gaming table before. Felix had vanished, and she was thrown with her arresting, innocent beauty upon the envious and jealous world. He had gone to exchange notes for counters, but she did not know. After a moment that was an hour, he returned and took the seat. "You stand behind me and watch," said he, "and when you get bored, walk about and see things for yourself. And when you need moral support again, come and put your hand on my chair. I'll stop playing whenever you tell me." He spoke in a muttering voice, but 3 or 4 persons around could not fail to catch every word. This, however, appeared not to trouble him. Lilian was in a state of high excitation, but she was also extremely confused, the game being a complete enigma to her. The croupier was continually raking cards to and fro, and counters to and fro, continually tearing tickets out of a book, ripping them to pieces and throwing the pieces behind him, continually dropping cards into a big hole, and continually dropping counters into a little hole. An official opposite the croupier, with pockets full of counters, was continually and with miraculous rapidity exchanging rose counters for green and white counters for rose. The player next to Felix had a small table behind him furnished with champagne and sandwiches, which he consumed in hasty gulps and mouthfuls, as one who feels the dread hour at hand when no man may eat or drink. The players ejaculated short, incomprehensible words, and at brief intervals Lilian seized a word that sounded like "bonko." She heard Felix utter the word, saw him turn up 2 cards, and then received from the croupier's rake a large assortment of green and rose counters. He never looked at her to smile. She was ignored, but she guessed that he must be winning. Soon afterwards his piles of counters had strangely diminished. The heat stifled her, and the odour of flesh and tobacco and scent nauseated. She held no key to the vast and splendid conundrum, unless by chance her fundamental common sense was right in its casual suggestion that she was surrounded by lunatics. Yet how could persons so well-dressed, so sure of themselves, so restrained and stylish in manner, and seemingly so wealthy, be lunatics? Impossible! She grew profoundly and inexplicably sad. At length she walked away, aimless. Felix did not notice her departure. She thought it almost certain that Lord Mackworth would be somewhere in the rooms. She desired about everything to avoid the danger incident to meeting him face to face, but she walked away. All the tables were the same as the table at which she had left Felix, crowded, entranced, self-concentrated, and perfectly unintelligible. And at every table the croupier was continually dropping counters into a little hole, and tearing up tickets, and throwing the fragments behind him onto the crimson carpet. The sole difference between the tables was that some held more banknotes than others. The heaps of blue 1,000-franc notes piled about one table caused Lilian to halt and gaze. "Some ready there," said a very young man to a fierce old woman. "Ah, but you should have seen it in the days of gold plaques before the war. You could call 100-franc gold piece ready then, if you like." The old woman sighed grimly. Lilian passed on under their combined stare. She glimpsed herself in mirrors, as once she used to glimpse herself in the shop windows of Bond Street, and was satisfied with the vision. Her walk was as remarkable as her beauty. Yes, she knew how to put her feet on the ground, and how to make her body float smoothly and evenly above the moving limbs. Her spirit rose as she began to suspect that no woman in the rooms were getting more notice than herself. Fancy Felix being absorbed in his gambling. She had forgotten Lord Mackworth. She decided that he was not in the rooms, and then suddenly, sprung from nothingness like a ghost, he stood in her path between the wall and the end of a table. She was disposed to retreat. Besides, his attention was fixed on the table, and she might get by him unperceived. But just as she approached, he turned. Although she might have ignored him, and in the circumstances was indeed entitled to do so, she did not because she could not. She blushed, only slightly, acknowledged their acquaintance with a faint smile, then stopped, but did not advance her hand to meet his. "Ought I have to have shaken hands?" she thought anxiously. All her quickly acquired worldliness of manner left her in an instant. She was the typewriting girl again, wearing the wristlets. He had all the physical splendour that she remembered, and the style and the benignant, large-hearted tolerance of an extensive sinner. As he looked at her, he drew back his chin and made several chins of it in just the old way. He was enormous, superb, and perfect. And if not a boy, he had real youth. Once more she had to contrast his youth with Felix's specious sprightliness. She fought on behalf of Felix in her mind, and on points Felix won. But in her mind Lord Mackworth had supporters which derided all reasoning. And as she fronted him, the old frightful apprehension was powerfully revived, and it seemed to be building a wall between her and the young man, and she was intensely dejected beneath the brightness of her demeanour. "Very hot here, isn't it?" she was saying. A stupid typewriting girl remark, she reflected as it slipped out. "A great change since I was here last, just before the war," said Lord Mackworth gaily. "Warmer, do you mean?" "No, much more cheery now, jollier." He waved a hand towards the company in general. "Oh, that," said Lilian, marshalling all her forces in a determined effort to lose the typewriting girl in the woman of the world. "You mean the company?" She shrugged her shoulders, borrowing some of his tolerance. "Of course you know they've been brought here on purpose. It's all part of a great battle for the command of the coast." The effort succeeded beyond her hopes. Lord Mackworth was clearly impressed. He put questions which Lilian answered out of mouth of Felix. Strange that this man should be he who had inexcusably omitted to pay his trumpery bill at Clifford Street, the man through whose unconscious agency she had been unjustly cast into the street. However, the past did not in the least affect her feeling for him. What she most vividly recalled was that she had striven to serve him and had served him. He made no reference, but doubtless from delicacy, to the night of their meeting. Nor did he betray even the very smallest surprise at seeing her, the typewriting girl, exquisitely and expensively dressed, in the finest Baccarat rooms on the Riviera. Of course, she might be married or have inherited a fortune. He could think as he chose. They went on talking, and then a pause came, and Lord Mackworth said bluntly, "I saw you from the yacht this afternoon." "Oh, what yacht?" "The Keter." "The big one? Is it yours?" "Oh, Lord, no. She belongs to my friend McMusson. We dined together here tonight." "It must be terribly big. I suppose you have an enormous party on board." "Oh, not a bit. Only McMusson and his 3 old aunts, and his niece, adopted daughter. Nobody else." "That's the girl you were making love to," Lilian's heart accused him. "She's going to be very rich, and she'll pay all your family debts. That's what it is. But what difference does it make?" her heart added. "You are you." And aloud, "I heard the yacht was leaving tonight." "She was, but I persuaded old McMusson to stop another day." "Really?" "And do you know why?" "No." "Because I had some hope of meeting you here tonight." She flushed again. She saw the ante-room at Clifford Street at the moment when he came back to ask her to wake him by telephone. He must have been well aware then that he had made a conquest, because in the ante-room she had not been able to hide her soft emotion. From that moment he had forgotten her, yet he could not have forgotten her. Perhaps he had somehow been prevented from meeting her in the meantime. Now, at the mere second sight of her, he had stopped the great yacht on the chance of talking to her. He had thrown over the young rich girl at a single glimpse of Lilian as she passed. It was astounding. But in fact she was not astounded. She glanced up at him. His smooth, handsome, red face was alive with admiration. And was she not really to be admired, even by the Lord Mackworths? Was she not marvellous? Did not all the company in the rooms regard her as marvellous? She thrilled to the romance of the incredible event. He was so young and big and strong and handsome. He had such prestige in her eyes. She saw visions. But the frightful apprehension, no longer a wall, rather a cloud, swallowed up the visions and froze the thrill. Felix held her. A gust of ruthless common sense inspired her to say primly, "It's always dangerous to give reasons for what one's done." And nodding, she left him. Immediately afterwards, she had to sit down. End of Part 3, Chapter 4. Part 3, Chapter 5 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 5, In the Hills. When she at length returned to Felix, and, squeezing through the outer rings of gladiators against chance, touched him delicately on the shoulder, he faced her with a bright youthful smile, and without any surprise. It was plain to her that he had recognized her from the light touch of her finger. "Do you want me to stop?" She nodded. He gathered his counters together and rose with alacrity. "You came in the nick of time," he said. "But of course you would. I've been playing wild, and I've made 1,000 francs into rather more than 6,000. It was the very moment to flee from the wrath that was coming. Let's run to the change desk before I change my mind and decide to begin to lose. That's the only insurance, getting rid of the counters, because when you've got rid of them, you're too ashamed with yourself to get more." He was quite uplifted, so gaily preoccupied with his achievement that he noticed nothing strange in her mien. She was glad that he noticed nothing, and yet also she was sorry. She would have liked him, after a single glance at her, to have said in his curt, quiet, assured manner, "What's wrong?" She kept thinking, but not of Felix. "He must be very fickle and capricious. I'm certain he was making love to her. He happens to see me, and off he runs after me. He can't be any good with his debts and things. I was right to give him the bird. But he's terribly nice, and I don't care. I don't know what on earth's the matter with me. I think I must be a bit mad, and always was. If I wasn't, should I be here?" Transiently she viewed herself as, for example, Gertie Jackson would have viewed her. And then she saw another and a worse self, and viewed that other self as Lilian, the staid and constant friend of Felix, would naturally view such an abandoned girl. She was afraid of, and disgusted by, the possibilities discovered in the depths of her own mind. At the desk, the dancing girl whom Felix had indicated as inhabiting their hotel hurried up passionately and forestalled them. She threw down the 2 green counters as it were in anger. "Can I play with that?" she exclaimed in Cockney English. The changer handed her 200-franc notes, which she crumpled in her hand. "I must find 100,000 francs from somewhere," she cried, departing. She was talking to herself. As she moved away, a stout oldish man with a thick lower lip, pearl studs in his shirt front, and a gleaming white waistcoat, joined her, and they disappeared together. Lilian stared after her in amazement. Felix's winnings suddenly seemed very insignificant. Still, when he received 6 fine, fresh 1,000-franc notes, besides some small notes, in exchange for valueless discs, and handed to her one of the fine, fresh notes, "That's for saving me from myself," she was impressed anew. A palace of magic, the baccarat rooms. The real thing, gambling. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. "Dance? No? Well, I'll do anything you like. Anything. The most absurd thing." "Is that talking?" They were moving somewhat aimlessly down the grand staircase. "Felix, darling," she murmured, "let's go for a motor run in the hills. There's a lovely moon. I should so love it." She desired to be alone with him, precisely as she had been alone with him in the taxi after their first dinner. She had a fancy for just that and nothing else. She pictured them together in the car, in the midst of gigantic nature, and in the brilliant night. "But it will be cold," he protested. "It wasn't cold when we came in here. It was quite warm. You said so," she replied softly. "But just as you please. I don't mind." And into the acquiescent charm of her voice she dropped one drop of angelic resentment, one single drop. Not because he objected to gratifying her, but because she knew he was merely fussing himself about his throat and his health generally. "We'll go, by all means. It won't take long," he yielded affectionately, without reserve. She pressed his arm. She had won. He began to suspect that she was overwrought, perhaps by the first sight of the spectacle of gambling on a great scale, and he soothed her accordingly. 6 automobiles were waiting and willing to take them into the hills. Before Lilian had regained full possession of herself, they were clear of the town and continually ascending in long curves. The night was magnificent. Through the close-shut windows of the car could be seen, not the moon, which was on high, but the strong moonlight and sharp shadows, and the huge, austere contours of the hills, and here and there a distant, steady, domestic lamp. Lilian sat in her corner, and Felix in his, and a space separated them because of the width of the car. She felt a peculiar constraint, and could not reach the mood she wanted. "Felix," she said, "you heard that girl say she must have 100,000 francs. How will she get it? How can she get it?" "Oh, she'll just disappear for a day or two, and then she'll come back with it. I dare say she owes most of it already to the casino." "But who will give it to her?" "Ha! That's her secret. There's always somebody in the background that these charmers have made themselves indispensable to. When this particular charmer tackles the particular man or men that she's indispensable to, she'll have what she needs out of them, if they've got it to give. That's a certainty. If a man has hypnotized himself into the belief that a girl's body is paradise, he'll win paradise and keep paradise. He'll steal, commit murder, sell his wife and children, abandon his parents to the workhouse. There's nothing he won't do. And he'll do it even if you should only let him kiss her feet. Of course all men aren't like that, but there are quite a few of them, and these charmers always find 'em out. Trust them." "I couldn't see that there was anything very extraordinary in her." "Neither could I. But perhaps we're blind to what that fellow who's going to fork out the 100,000 francs sees. I dare say if I were to dance with her I might have glimpses of his notion of her. Anyhow, you bet she's a highly finished product. She's got great gifts and great skill, must have, and she knows exactly what she's about. And she looks 18 and isn't above 25. You must remember she's on the way to being a star in the most powerful profession in the world. They've made practically all the history there is, even in the East. They're still making it this very night." There was a considerable silence, and then Lilian shot across the seat and leaned heavily against Felix and clasped his neck. "Darling," she said, "I know I'm going to have a baby." They could just see each other. Felix paused before replying. Very well, he said calmly. "We shall see who's right." Her thoughts concerning Lord Mackworth now seemed utterly incredible to her in their mad aberration. The next moment the car swerved unexpectedly to the side of the mounting road, and the engine stopped. The chauffeur jumped down, opened the bonnet, unstrapped one of the side lamps, and peered with it into the secrets under the bonnet. Felix, loosing himself from Lilian, rapped sharply on the front window, but got no response from the bent chauffeur. Then impatiently he tried to let down the window, and could not. He lifted it, shook it, rattled it, broke the fragile fastening of the strap. Suddenly the window fell with a bang into its slit, and there was a tinkling of smashed glass. "Damn it! I ought to have opened the door, but I was afraid of too much cold." The icy air of the hills rushed like an assassin into the interior of the car. Felix shivered, unlatched the door, and got out. The chauffeur proved to be an Italian with no more French than sufficed to take orders and receive fares and tips. He could give no intelligible explanation of the breakdown, but he smiled optimistically. The car was absolutely alone on the road, and the road was alone in the vast implacable landscape. No light anywhere, except the chilly, dazzling moon and the stars, and the glitter of a far range of godlike peaks whence came the terrible wind. The scene and situation intimidated. The inhuman and negligent grandeur of nature was revealed. Felix returned into the car and shut the door, but could not shut out the cold. Lilian covered his chest with her warm bosom. Gently he pushed her away. "No, no." "Let me, darling." "It's no use. I shall suffer for this." After a few minutes the engine was throbbing again, and they had begun the descent. But no device could conjure away the ruthless night air. Back at the hotel, Felix took brandy and hot water, accepted Lilian's hot water bag in addition to his own, and was in bed and thickly enveloped in no time at all. Lilian kissed him guiltily and left him. He bade her good night kindly but absently, engrossed in himself. End of Part 3, Chapter 5. Part 3, Chapter 6 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 6, The Benefactress. When Lilian was alone in her room, she thought anxiously, "Supposing he should want more brandy in the night? There is none." The travelling flask was now empty. In the emergency, hot water from the lavatory basin tap had been used to dilute the brandy, Felix having said impatiently that any water would do so long as it was hot. Hang a few germs. She noticed that he would always take a little brandy if he felt unwell from whatever cause, and this habit caused her no uneasiness, for from her father she had acquired a firm belief in the restorative qualities of brandy. Even her mother would say how unwise it was to be without brandy, and before starting for the annual domestic holiday invariably attended herself to the provision of it. The lack of brandy settled upon Lilian's mind, intensifying somehow her sense of guilt. She felt deeply the responsibilities of the situation, which became graver and graver to her, the more so as she had no real status to deal with it. She wanted to ring the bell, but the bell was within a few yards of Felix's door. He often complained on this score, and to ring might be to wake him. Cautiously she stepped into the corridor, hoping to find Jacqueline in the service room at the end of the shabby little side corridor where the bell and the room indicator were. She knew the French for brandy. The main corridor stretched away with an effect of endlessness. In its whole length only 2 electric lights had been left to burn. Solitude and silence made it mysteriously solemn. A pair of boots, or 2 pairs of boots, one large, one small and dainty, here and there on a doormat, seemed inexplicably to symbolize the forlornness of humanity in the sight of the infinite. The beating of Lilian's heart attracted her attention. Not without an effort could she cross the magic and formidable corridor. The door of the service room was locked. No hope. Even Jacqueline had a bed somewhere and was asleep in it, and brandy was as unattainable as on a coral island. Lilian felt the rough hair-lining of pleasure. The idea of her insecurity frightened her. She perceived that a life of toil, abstinence, deprivation, and cold virginity had its advantages. Of course Felix was not going to be ill, but if he were, and if her dreadful fears about her own condition were realized, what then? What would happen? Were the moral maxims and strict practice of her parents, after all, horribly true? The wages of sin, and all that sort of thing. She heard steps in the distance of the corridor. She peeped. Somebody was approaching. Had she time to cross and vanish into the shelter of her room? She hesitated. The visitant was a woman. It was the girl who in the Baraka rooms had talked of 100,000 francs in a Cockney accent, the girl whom Felix had described as probably a rising star in the most powerful of professions. She too had a bed, and was seeking it at last. "I expect there's no chance of getting hold of a servant tonight," said Lilian meekly, as the girl instinctively paused in passing. The girl, staring sharply out of her artificially enlarged eyes, shrugged the shoulders of negation at Lilian's simplicity. "Anything the matter?" "I only wanted some brandy. My husband," she meant to say, but could not frame the majestic word. "My friend's not very well. Chill. He's had a very little brandy, and might need some more in the night." She flushed. "Come along with me. I'll let you have some." What a harsh, rasping little voice. The benefactress's bedroom was in a state of rich disorder that astounded Lilian. The girl turned on every light in the chamber, banged the door, and pushing some clothes off a chair, told Lilian to sit down. Drawers were opened, cupboards were open, the wardrobe was open. Attire, boxes, bottles, parcels, candles, parasols, illustrated comic papers, novels with shiny coloured covers were strewn everywhere, and in a corner a terrific trunk stood upright. The benefactress began ferreting in drawers and slamming them to one after another. "I'm afraid I've put you to a lot of trouble," said Lilian. "You're very kind, I'm sure." "Not a bit of it. I never can find anything. I think us girls ought to stand by each other, that's what I think. Not as we ever do." Her voice seemed to thicken, almost to break. Lilian felt as if the entire hotel had trembled under her feet, but she gave no sign of shock. She desired the brandy, if it was to be had. Us girls. "You are French, aren't you? I only ask because you speak English so well." After a moment the girl replied, her head buried in a drawer. "You bet I'm French.
My mother sent me to a convent in London so as I could learn English properly. It's one of them boarding convents where you're free to do what you like, so as long as you're in by 7 o'clock. They wanted a few French girls for the chorus of a review at the Pavilion. As soon as I got in there, I never went back to the convent. I've never seen my ma since either. I was in that chorus for a year. Oh!" She produced an ingenious and costly travelling spirit case, and then searched for the key of it. "I wish I could speak French half as well as you speak English. If I had half your face and your figure, I'd give all my English to anybody that cared to have it. Oh, damn the key. Excuse me. Here you are." She offered the disengaged flask. "Now you go along and take what you want and bring me the flask back." She stood in front of Lilian, who rose. She was as flat as Millie Slate, and neither tall nor graceful. Every lineament of the pert face, so heavily masked in paint and powder, every gesture, the 2 bright stockings, the gilded shoes, the impudent coiffure, the huge and flashy rings, the square-dialed wristwatch, all were crudely symptomatic of an ingrained and unalterable vulgarity. Lilian was absolutely unable to understand how any man, however coarse and cynical, could find any charm of any kind in such a girl. But Lilian did not know that intense vulgarity is in itself irresistible to certain amateurs of women, and she was far too young really to appreciate the sorcery of mere lithe youthfulness. "Why, what is it?" Lilian exclaimed as she took the flask. Tears were ravaging the cheeks of the benefactress. "Oh, damn!" The benefactress stamped her foot and raised her thin, loose, bare shoulders. "Gambling's it. I always lose here. It's all shemmy here, and when you win at shemmy you take other people's money, not the bank's, and that puts me off like at the start. And you never win if you don't feel as if you were going to. I was at Monte Carlo last week, and you should have seen me at Roulette taking the casino money. I couldn't do wrong. But I had to come back here, and there you are. Lost it all, and a lot more." She was speaking through her tears. "Cleaned out tonight, naked. You see, it's like this. Gambling gives you an emotion. It's the only thing there is for that. For me. Did you see that fat beast speak to me tonight at the casino? Well, he said something to me and offered me 10,000 francs, and I slapped his face for him in the entrance hall. He knew I was stony. I was a fool. Why shouldn't I have done what he wanted? What's it matter? But no, I'm like that, and I slapped his face, and I'd do it again, I would. He's Scapini, you know, the biggest shareholder in both the big hotels here. I tore it, I did. And would you believe I'd no sooner got in here afterwards than the manager told me I must leave tomorrow morning. It's all over the place as quick as that. I've only got to go to Paris to get all the money I want. Yeah. But I'd sell myself for a year to be able to pay my bills straight off in the morning and cheek 'em. It'll be near 1,000 francs, and I've then got 10 francs, besides having the whole bally town against me." She laughed and threw her head back. "Here, you go along. Don't listen to me. It's not the first time, neither the last. Go along now." "I'm very sorry," said Lilian. She simply could not conceive that the girl, possibly no older than herself, was standing alone and unaided against what was to her the universe. How could these girls do it? What was the quality in them that enabled them to do it? She was in the intimidated, silent, mystery-hiding corridor again. She listened at the door, which she had left ajar, between the bathroom and Felix's bedroom. No sound. In the solacing, perfect tidiness of her room, she poured some of the brandy into a glass, and then, taking her bag, returned to the benefactress. "Here's your flask. Thank you very much," she said. "And here's 1,000 francs if it's any use to you." She produced the note which Felix had given to her. The money was accepted, greedily. "If you're here in a week's time, in 5 days, you'll have it back," said the benefactress, looking at her wristwatch. "No, it's too late to go and play again now." She giggled. "Tell me your name. You can trust me. I don't believe you're real, though. You couldn't be. There aren't such girls, anyhow at your age." She stopped and gave a tremendous youthful sigh. "Ah," she exclaimed, "if only I was dead. I often dream of lying in my grave. Eternal peace, no emotions, no men, quite still, stretched straight out, quiet for ever and ever. Eternal peace. Do you know, I've been like that all my life. My God." Lilian burst into tears, agonized. The original benefactress flung herself at the other benefactress with amazing violence, and they kissed, weeping. A quarter of an hour later, the defier of Scapini murmured, "I wish to heaven I could do something for you." Lilian answered, "I wish you'd tell me how you stain your skin that lovely Spanish colour." And she immediately received not merely the instructions, but the complete materials necessary for the operation. End of Part 3, Chapter 6. Part 3, Chapter 7 of Lilian by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 7, The Doctor. When she awoke the next morning after a very few hours' sleep, she did so suddenly, to a full consciousness of her situation, and not little by little, passing by gradual stages to realization, as was her wont. She listened. No sound came through the two half-open doors. The brandy had not been needed. Perhaps he was asleep. Perhaps he'd had a good night and was perfectly restored. She rose, unfastened the window, and very quietly pushed back the shutters. It was raining. Just as she was, her hair loose and the delicate and absurd rag of a night-dress all untied, she surveyed herself sternly in the mirror. She was well content with her beauty. Impossible to criticize it. In every way she was far more beautiful than the nameless woman whom she befriended and who had befriended her. Partly because she had been generous to her, she felt sympathy for the girl. The phrase, "us girls," stung her still, but it was not ill meant. In fact, it was a rather natural phrase, and no doubt already her acquaintance must have perceived how wrong it was. She admired the girl for her fierce defiance and courage, and for the intense passion with which she desired the grave. Stretched straight out, quiet for ever and ever. Startling and outrageous words in that harsh young voice, but there was something fine about them. I may say the same one day soon, Lilian thought solemnly. Moreover, she understood better the power of the girl, whose kiss and clasp had communicated to her a most disconcerting physical thrill. Indeed, it seemed to her that she was on the threshold of all sorts of new comprehensions. Finally, she had astonished the girl by the grand loan. She had shone, she had pleased, she had satisfied her instinct to give pleasure. She thought, "She may be stronger than I am, and cleverer, but she is very silly, and I am not. And I am not weak either, even if some people take me for weak." It was disturbing, though, how that phrase pricked and pricked. Us girls. Little flames shot up from the ashes of her early and abandoned religion. The wages of sin. The wages of sin. Was it true about the wages of sin? Was she to be punished? The great terrible fear of conception still dominated her soul, and it grew hourly. At each disappointing dawn the torture of it increased. She saw the powders and preparations which the courtesan had given her. She recalled the minute directions for the use of them, and smiled painfully. How could the prospective mother employ such devices? Nevertheless, if she escaped, she would employ them as soon as Felix was better. She knew that Felix would delight in the perverse, provocative transformation, and she yearned to gratify him afresh in a novel manner. When the surprise came upon him, he would pretend that it was nothing, but he would be delighted, he would revel in it. Putting on her peignoir, she slipped noiselessly into the other bedroom and crept up to the bed. Needless precaution. Felix was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Before speaking, she tenderly kissed him, and kept her face for a moment on his. "Better?" "Had an awful night. Couldn't sleep a wink. I won't get up just yet. Order me tea instead of coffee. We'll go out after lunch, not before." "Do you think you ought to go out, dearest?" "Of course I ought to go out," he snapped peevishly. "It's raining." "Oh, well, if it's raining, I dare say I shan't want to go out." He placed his hand nervously on his right breast. "Does it hurt you?" "Not at all. Can't I touch myself?" She kissed him again. Then he gazed at her with love as she moved over him to ring the bell. "You all right?" "Oh, splendid. I listened once or twice at the door, but as I didn't hear anything, I made sure you were asleep." She kept silent about her awful, persistent fear, knowing that any reference to it would only irritate him. He was more than ever like a child, and a captious child. She realized the attitude of his sister towards him. Thank God he was better. If he'd have fallen ill, she would have condemned herself as a criminal for life, for her insane, selfish suggestion of an excursion to the hills at night. Not he, but she, was the child. After his tea he did get up and dress, but he would not descend to lunch, nor eat in the bedroom. At 3 o'clock he said that when it rained on the Riviera the climate was the most damnable on earth, and that he preferred to be in bed. And to bed he returned. Then Lilian noticed him fingering his breast again. "Any pain there?" "Oh, nothing, only a sort of sensation." Soon afterwards he gave a few very faint, short, dry coughs, scarcely perceptible efforts to clear the throat. And at the same time Lilian went cold. She knew that cough. She had helped to nurse her father. It was the frightening pneumonia cough. Almost simultaneously it occurred to her that Felix was trying to hide from her a difficulty in breathing. She had not dreamed of anything so bad as pneumonia, which for her was the direst of all diseases, and she with a plan for dyeing her skin to amuse and excite him. She had thought of a severe chill at the worst. She hurried downstairs to see the concierge. The lift was too slow in coming up for her. She had to run down the flights of carpeted steps one after another. The main question on her mind was, ought I to telegraph to his sister? If Miss Grigg arrived, what could happen to herself? The concierge, a dark, haughty, long-moustached, somewhat consumptive subject, adored Lilian for her beauty, and she had rewarded his worship with exquisite smiles and tones. "Would you like the English doctor, madame?" said he. "Is there an English doctor here?" She was immensely relieved. She would be able to talk to an English doctor, whereas a French doctor with his shrugs and science and understanding nothing you said. "Surely, madame, I will telephone at once, madame. He will be here in 1/4 hour. I know where he is. He is a very good doctor." "Oh, thank you." Concierges were marvellous persons. As soon as she had gone again, the concierge made all the pages tremble. It was the thwarted desire to kneel at Lilian's feet and kiss her divine shoes that caused him to terrorize the pages. As for telegraphing to Miss Grigg, she decided that obviously she could send no message till the doctor had examined and reported. In regard to the hotel authorities and servants, she now had no shame. She alone was responsible for Felix's welfare, and she would be responsible, and they must all think what they liked about her relations with him. She didn't care. The concierge was indeed marvellous, for in less than 20 minutes there was a knock at Felix's door. Lilian opened, saw a professional face with hair half sandy, half grey, and turning to Felix murmured, "It's the doctor, darling." Felix, to whom she had audaciously said not a word about sending for a doctor, actually sat up, furious. "I'm not going to see a doctor," he gasped. I'm not going to see any doctor." "Come in, doctor, please." The moment was dramatic. Felix was of course beaten. "You'll find me in the next room, doctor," she said after a minute, and the doctor bowed. In another 10 minutes the doctor entered her bedroom. "It's a mild attack of pneumonia," said he, standing in front of her. "Very mild. I can see no cause for anxiety. You'd better have a nurse for the night." "I would sooner sit up myself," Lilian answered. "I've nursed pneumonia before." "Then have a nurse for the day," the doctor suggested. "I could get an English one from the Alexandra Hospital, a very good one. She might come in at once and stay till 10 o'clock, say." Then he proceeded to the treatment, prescriptions, and so on. An English nurse! Lilian felt extraordinarily grateful and reassured. She knew where she was now. She was in England again. "Ought I to telegraph home?" she asked. "I shouldn't if I were you," the doctor replied. "Better to wait for a day or two. Telegrams are so disturbing, aren't they?" His gentle manner was inexpressibly soothing. It was so soothing that just as he was leaving she kept him back with a gesture. "Doctor, before you go, I wish you would do something for me." And she sat down, her face positively burning, and shed tears. In the night, as she sat with Felix, the patient's condition unquestionably improved. He even grew cheerful and laudatory. "You're a great girl," he muttered weakly but firmly. "I know I was most absurdly cross, but I'm a rotten invalid." She looked at him steadily, and her secret resolve enfeebled by his surprising and ravishing appreciation, she let forth, against the dictates of discretion, the terrific fact which was overwhelming her and causing every fibre in her to creep. "It's true what I told you?" "What?" "You know—" A pause. "How do you know it's true?" "The doctor—" His reception of the tidings falsified every expectation. He waited a moment and then said calmly, "That's all right. I'll see to that." She did not kiss him, but sitting on the bed put her head beside his on the pillow. Seen close, his eyelashes appeared as big as horsehairs and transcendently masculine. She tasted the full, deep savour of life then, moveless, in an awkward posture, in the midst of the huge, sleeping hotel. She had no regrets, no past, only a future. End of Part 3, Chapter 7.